Senate Bill 325 is on third reading for final passage. Chair recognizes the minority whip on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's actually interesting. We just had a bill to get rid of a fee, which I did vote for. So now it's fascinating some of what we're doing here this session. We had a couple weeks ago, Governor Moore spoke about in his State of the State address about the high cost of living and Maryland's economic competitiveness, and to totally agree with. Maryland's the 7th highest cost living state in the country, and I think sometimes what happens with legislation that we have come through the General Assembly is that we as lawmakers look at it a lot of times in a vacuum as that specific policy, and whether that policy is something we like or would want to emulate or is good or not. And of course, that's not a bad thing necessarily. You should take policies on their merits. But when we're talking about adding another tax onto the backs of Marylanders, Maryland consumers, small businesses, contractors, I think we need to stop and look at it in the context of the broader situation of a state that is extremely expensive to live in. And so I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about this, because to start with, it's not just that it's an additional sales tax on every can of paint sold in the state. Looks like if we follow the model of a couple of other states, you could have taxes on a 5-gallon or gallon of paint that could be as much as $1, $1.25, sometimes higher, sometimes a little lower, and all to fund a recycling program. Well, of course, who could be against funding a recycling program? Of course, as we established in our questioning last week to remind the body, over half of our counties in the state already have paid for out of property tax money, generally, a recycling program anyway. Paint is not toxic. It is not hazardous. It's not a hazardous material, and so it's something that can be recycled. It can be thrown away safely. But the argument would be, well, we need to establish this recycling program for paint, and it needs to be outside of the current structure we have for setting up recycling. And as we talked about last week, this bill is being pushed by a segment of the industry, corporations that have come together to form a trade association, American Coatings Association, and they have set up a national nonprofit entity that then sets up chapters in these different states. They own the nonprofit. The staffing of the nonprofit is a well-compensated group. Turns out the CEO of the nonprofit is also the CEO of American Coatings Association. So he makes almost $1 million just on the nonprofit side. I don't know, I was not able to calculate the salary on the other side. And again, I'm not against anybody making good money in the private sector. I think that's great. But when we're asking Maryland taxpayers to pay every time they buy paint into a nonprofit for something that, again, over half the state already does out of their tax dollars, I think we need to stop and ask ourselves why we're doing this. I also think we need to stop and ask ourselves, is this the direction? Second question, is this what we want to do to taxpayers? Is the first question, to make them pay for something to basically benefit a corporate interest, because they'll get to recycle the product, they'll get you to come back into the stores to drop off the paint so you get back in the store, so that benefits them. Number two, and it's coming out of their pockets. And number two, is this something that we want to do from the standpoint of public policy, where we're going to start saying, for things that we think are maybe a little bit difficult to recycle, that are not single stream recycling or disposal, we're going to start adding extra taxes on. And you may say, well, what are you talking about? This is just about paint. Well, in that currently there are 2 bills in the General Assembly that have been proposed that also create a program. They're both from some of our good friends over in the House of Delegates, but this bill started as only a House bill too, several years ago. There's one that would cover electronic devices, creating a new fee on electronic devices for electronic device recycling program that would add a tax, I'm assuming, or as some folks like to call it, an assessment, on electronic devices sold in the state. And there's also a bill in that would set this same kind of concept up for a mattress stewardship program to recycle mattresses. So, I think it's worth taking a few minutes to really consider what we're doing here. Are we going to now start creating programs that taxpayers pay for on top of what they already pay for to have recycling and landfills and waste processing? We're going to add additional programs for that. Now, that's not this bill, but I think you have to understand the context of what people like me are looking at and what our taxpayers are looking at. So that's the second question. Is that going to be a new policy where we start itemizing different things to recycle and adding a special sales tax onto those products? And then finally, third, I think we have to ask ourselves, even if you reject the logic that we don't want to keep adding costs to Marylanders and to small businesses for this paint tax, you may say it's a worthy goal because it's going to help us recycle more, and we have to recycle. Recycling is good, and of course I try to recycle, and I agree. I think the third point you have to ask yourself, is it actually going to really work? That's actually the most important question, probably. And the evidence is in from a lot of other states that this, not only does this add a tax to everybody's bill when they buy paint, and not only is it something that that adds cost of living, but it also really doesn't work that well. I did a little research. The recovery rates, there are several states that do this already, and that Paint Care is involved in. Paint Care is the nonprofit. And the recovery rates in fiscal year 2023 in these different states, on the high end, Vermont, they recover 13% of paint in the state and recycle it. 13%. That's the high end. So that means Vermont taxpayers are paying, every time they buy paint, they're paying a tax so that 13% of the paint can be recycled. In California, it's under 5%. Some other states, it's 5, 6, 7%. Washington, D.C. has this. It's 3% recovery for this paint recycling program. So every time our taxpayers, our constituents are going to go buy paint, our small businesses that are going to go buy paint are going to pay this tax. Might be as much as $1, $1.25 for every can of paint they buy. Could be more, could be less. It's supposed to be enough to fund the program. Every time they go, they're paying in so that we can recycle maybe 5, 6, 7% of the paint that they're buying. It doesn't seem like a good deal to me. Furthermore, California had $28 million in revenue in FY 2023 and somehow had $35 million in expenditures to recycle 5% of the paint. That's from their report. I have it here on my desk. I don't think that's a good deal for taxpayers. I don't think that's a good deal for Maryland. It is a good deal for the companies that have set this nonprofit up. It's a great deal for them because they're bringing in a good bit of revenue. So, Mr. President, I would just strongly urge the body that this is not the time to add another burden onto taxpayers. I would say period. But if you think you're willing to add a little additional burden every time someone buys a can of paint, number one, I hope we're not going to start a trend where we're going to create this for lots of other products. Apparently some folks in our General Assembly have some other ideas to do that. But number two, I really don't think it's a fair deal to say you're going to pay into this corporate-run nonprofit for something that, in the best case scenario, in a very small state, Vermont, only achieved a 13% recycle rate. And in places like Colorado, 6%, Connecticut, 7%, Minnesota's up to 11%, but California's under 5%. That does not seem like a good deal to me, Mr. President. I would urge the body to vote red on this, and we could come back to the drawing board, maybe figure out a way we can help our counties set up a better program. But I don't think this is the way to go. It's a bad deal for taxpayers, and it's not a good deal for the environment. Frankly, I'm imagining in California, if they had $30 million, they could probably do something better on recycling than running it through a corporate-run nonprofit that is recycling about 5% of the paint total in the state. So, Mr. President, I would urge the body to vote no on this bill. Thank you.